We are live. Yay. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi,
And
sorry I didn't hop on earlier.
no, you're okay. I think we're all ready. I'm going to start letting folks in. We are now live on Facebook.
Hi, everybody. I think probably some of you are still getting your sound set up, but thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here to talk about NTEC and fracking and fossil gas and all of that, and to answer some of your questions if you have them. I think we are going to wait just another minute or two to see if there are folks who are still trying to join, work out any tech issues. So sit tight for, another minute or two, and then we'll get started. Hello to the new folks who have just joined. I was just saying we're going to wait another minute or two before we get started while everybody gets on board our Zoom call. And as we're waiting, if you are all interested, it would be great if you could do some introductions in the chat. You can put in your name and your pronouns if you'd like, and where you're joining us from. I'm excited to see where you all are. Oh, Jenna put it in the chat already, thanks. All right, so if we can move on to the next slide, I think we can get started, and then anyone else can join in as we go. But thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you here. There's a good crowd, so I'm looking forward to getting started. Please feel free to continue putting in your name and pronouns if you'd like, and location in the chat. As we get started, I see there are people from different places in Wisconsin, some Minnesota, Maple Grove, Minnesota. Thanks for sharing. It's great to see where you are all at. All right, so I'm gonna start us off today, if we can move one forward, with a land acknowledgement. And so I'll start that, but then feel free to share if you know the ancestral land that you are joining us from in the chat as well. So today we are meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of tribes who have called this land home for time immemorial. Each of us is joining today from a different space with a different history. I am coming from the traditional and current lands of the Ho-Chunk, Meskwaki, and Great Sioux Nations, and the Kickapoo and Peoria tribes. And like I said, I invite you to share where you're joining from in the chat. And if you don't know, to spend some time learning about the history of the land that you're on. Starting in the early 1800s, the US government engaged in treaty making and treaty breaking, deceit, violence, and various forms of genocide. And this was done to take land for the benefit of white settlers and their descendants. And we commit to fully acknowledging this truth and the harms done and engaging in reparative actions with Native peoples, which includes advocating for Native nations treaty rights, respecting Native sovereignty and culture, and contributing resources to Native-led efforts to heal from generations of trauma, as well as supporting their ongoing relationship with their ancestral lands. And this acknowledgement is both important and also not enough. So yeah, please make sure that you are learning and growing and continuing to make amends, repair what has been broken, etc. And thank you all for sharing in the chat. So I'm going to now just briefly talk through our agenda for today. I guess actually before I do that, I'll just say who I am, since I know some of you, but not all of you. My name is Jadine Sanada, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a campaign coordinator with the Sierra Club chapter here in Wisconsin, involved in this NTEC fight. Again, just so excited to have you here today. So we'll be starting off talking about NTEC, a brief review of what it is, and giving you a little bit more background on that project, and then talking through the Energy We Can't Afford Week of Action, which is happening over in Minnesota right now. So hopefully some of you have been engaged and involved in that. I hear it's going well, so glad that that is going on and that we are finishing off the week with this awesome webinar. And then we'll be hearing a little bit from Pastor Bridget Jones on why she's in this movement and kind of grounding us in this work. We'll get some updates on what is happening in Minnesota and Wisconsin, since this proposed fracked gas plant is jointly proposed by two utilities. So there are processes happening on both sides. And then we are going to hear more about fossil gas or fracked gas, and then have some time for any questions that you all might have, and then close with just talking about how you can get more involved, and seeing if you have other ideas for how we can fight back and advocate for clean energy and a greener future. So that, actually first I'll go through just, I am sure that many of you are familiar with Zoom already, but on the next slide, I have this little overview just of the commands buttons. So some of you are in the chat, and that's down there on your right. And I am pretty sure you're all muted because I don't hear any background noise, which is great. But that little microphone button will toggle you on and off mute, and we'll ask that you please stay on mute for now while we're hearing from our presenters. And then if you'd like to hide or share your video, there's a little camera icon there that you can click to do that. And if you have any tech problems throughout the event, just feel free to type that in the chat, and we'll have somebody come and try and troubleshoot with you as we go. So with that, I am going to pass this off to Jenna, who is my awesome counterpart in Minnesota.
Thanks, Jadine. Hi all, so good to see so many of you from across both states, across Wisconsin and across Minnesota. I am the organizing representative in Duluth, Minnesota with the Sierra Club, and work really closely with Jadine and all of our partners on fighting gas. I use she, her pronouns, and yes, I live in Duluth. Just wanted to share a very brief overview of what our Energy We Can't Afford campaign is, and why we're doing this week of action. We're a coalition of Minnesota energy advocates, which includes Sierra Club, MN350, solar groups, Fresh Energy, Community Solar, Environment Minnesota, and Cooperative Energy Futures. And we seek to educate Minnesotans on the danger of fossil gas or fracked gas, and steer energy policy towards a brighter and cleaner future. And I will put the link in the chat once we're through this section. And our campaign has launched a week of action this week to drive awareness of the dangers of fossil gas and to support community engagement, to urge our utilities across the state and here in the Twin Ports, of course, to reject fossil fuels. And this week we've supported activists in Minnesota to put pressure on their utilities by making videos. We've been tweeting at utility CEOs. We've collected petition signatures and submitted comments to the Public Utilities Commission. And we're highlighting every day different ways fossil gas hurts our planet and our communities. And we'll hear more about that today from our presenters. And then next, I just want to share a little bit about the Nemadji Trail Energy Center, so we can go to the next few slides there. What is this thing and why are we gathering here today? So quickly, two utilities, Minnesota Power, our investor-owned utility in Minnesota, and Dairyland Power Cooperative in Wisconsin have asked regulators for permission to build a new 525 megawatt fossil gas power plant, the Nemadji Trail Energy Center, or NTEC, as you'll hear throughout our presentation today, in Superior, Wisconsin. And Kumi, you can head to the next slide. So this proposed gas plant would be built in Superior, Wisconsin. And as you can see on the map there on the right, the proposed site is very close to Duluth and it's very close to Lake Superior. And we know that NTEC would cost ratepayers like me and like you over $700 million, plus another $200 million for pipelines and infrastructure to support the plant. And if built, we know that NTEC would emit over 1 million tons of carbon each year. And we as climate advocates, as community leaders, we just don't think that this plant makes sense for our economy, our warming climate, and our changing communities. And the utilities must receive approval by regulators in both Wisconsin and Minnesota, because this plan is a joint venture between the utilities from both states. And as we've all experienced, the unfolding of this year has really thrown regulatory and state processes for a loop, and it's proved to be challenging to organize the fight against new fossil fuel infrastructure while legal and regulatory processes are on pause or up in the air. And so today we'll learn about what's going on in both states and what opportunities we have to engage. And I'm so excited to introduce a friend and comrade in this fight, Pastor Bridget Jones, who's a pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church on the south side of Superior, Wisconsin, and a resident of Superior. As she says, she is passionate about caring for creation and joining God's work in the healing of our earth. And I will hand it over to Bridget to kind of ground us in why we're doing this. Thanks, Bridget.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenna. So like Jenna said, my name is Pastor Bridget, and I serve and live on the south side of Superior. When I moved here from Chicago about 2 years ago, I knew that I wanted to get involved in environmental justice because after living in Chicago, I've been able to see how pollution is usually focused in areas that are poorer and more difficult to organize. And honestly, when I knew I was going to move here, but before I had actually moved here, that's when Superior had a refinery fire. And the Nemadji River is already polluted. There was a train that was carrying hydrocarbons that dumped them all into the river back in the 70s. And so we already know how fossil fuels can damage our environment. The last thing that we need here is another fossil fuel project. And so one of the first things I did when I came here was I joined the Sierra Club. And I went to a press conference against the Nemadji Trail Energy Center before I really even knew what it was. And I remembered I didn't have a speaking part. I just stood in the background and held a sign that said, "It's a bad deal." Since then, we've shown up at other press conferences and hearings and budget listening sessions and more to continue to say that this is a bad deal, not just for our community, but for our planet. And this process is really confusing and difficult, especially because Superior is not going to benefit from this project. We have our own utility, Superior Water, Power, and Light, but it's in our city. And so it seems really convoluted and difficult to see who to appeal to. And so even though we know it's a bad deal and we don't want it here, this process seems to continue moving slowly and confusingly and almost inexorably toward approval. And so it's obvious to know why I'm in this fight, but why am I still in it, even though it's hard and it's difficult and it seems like maybe our work isn't doing anything. So this year, especially right now, I'm remembering that Christians are in the season of Advent. It's a season where we are waiting and preparing for the birth of Jesus and the brand new kingdom that he brings. Even though my fellow Christians love to say that Jesus is the reason for the season, they are wrong. Jesus is not the reason for the season. The turning of the earth is the reason for the season. Even before Jesus was born, people in the Northern Hemisphere were getting tired of long nights and cold days, where it seemed like summer was a really long time away and we wondered if it would ever come back. So all the holidays around this time are basically a celebration of the solstice, the longest night of the year, and a reminder that the world turns, that the days will be longer and warmer, and spring will return, that it will not be like this forever. The world is already turning around us. We can see that renewable energy is cheaper all the time. More and more coal plants are getting shut down. Banks are refusing to lend to fossil fuel projects. And so even in the midst of setbacks, it continues to happen. The world is turning. It will not be like this forever. And so here in my little corner of the world, I'll keep pushing, even when it's hard, even when it's discouraging, so that the world will turn just a little faster, so we get to the world that we want even sooner. And I'm glad you're with me in this fight.
Thank you, Bridget. Thanks so much. And I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Jessica Tritch, who is filling in last minute for Paul Blackburn, who is an attorney for Honor the Earth. And as those in Minnesota know, stuff's blowing up with Line 3. And Paul was in a hearing earlier this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Tritch. Thank you, Jessica, for filling in. Jessica is the senior campaign representative with the Beyond Coal to Clean Energy campaign and has been working with the Sierra Club in Minnesota for, I think, over 11 years now, and started our Duluth Clean Energy team several years ago and works to support the transition from fossil fuels to clean, equitable energy across Minnesota. And I know that her heart is with us in Duluth. So Jessica, thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Jenna said, my name is Jessica Tritch, and I'm excited to sub in as Paul is actually still at the hearing. It is still happening right now. So I want to talk a little bit about this gas plant in Minnesota and where we're at and where we're going. And I will respond to Bridget saying that while I completely agree that it is incredibly frustrating and slow and challenging to dig into this process, every day that this plant is not built is excellent. Delay is good because honestly, clean energy alternatives are just looking better and better, and they were looking great in 2018. So there we are. So I'll just get started, especially for folks who aren't as familiar with Minnesota Power, which is the utility that is proposing NTEC with Dairyland Power in Wisconsin. So Minnesota Power on the Minnesota side is a utility based in Duluth. Its headquarters is in Duluth, and it serves a large amount of residential customers in Duluth, but most of the power that they produce goes to several very large industrial customers, primarily iron mines and paper mills. It is also anticipated, or at least the utility is anticipating it going towards new proposed sulfide mining projects that they support, which the Sierra Club does not support, and pipelines, the Line 3 pipeline. Which again, the Sierra Club does not support. So they are proposing, they have a significant amount of industrial customers, and then anticipates or are planning for more. Back when I started this work 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 95% of Minnesota Power's electricity was generated from coal. And now it's not quite there. It's more like half, which is getting towards half, which is good. They are making significant progress. However, they are still planning. They still operate a very large coal plant in Cohasset, Minnesota, the Clay Boswell plant. And as you all know, they are proposing to build quite a large gas plant in Superior, the NTEC plant. And as we know, we need to be moving towards 100% clean renewable energy in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and not building new fossil fuel plants. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of this plant. So Minnesota Power proposed this plant a couple years ago. I can see this lovely picture of folks fighting the plant along the way. And it had to be approved in Minnesota by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. So the commission is what regulates all the electrical utilities in Minnesota. We don't get a choice of who our energy provider is, right? Wherever you move, that's who provides your electricity. And so Minnesota Power they are then regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So Minnesota Power proposed this plant, and there was a process in front of the commission. Sierra Club, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, Clean Grid Alliance, and Fresh Energy were part of the kind of procedure, the process at the PUC, and we fought this plant from the very beginning. Our bottom line was that Minnesota Power didn't need this plant. We did a significant amount of analysis to show that the plant was not actually needed by Minnesota Power customers and would end up costing them more. So we found that Minnesota Power overestimated the amount of electricity they actually were going to need, that they didn't thoroughly examine alternatives, that Minnesota law actually requires utilities look at clean energy alternatives before proposing fossil fuel plants, and that they could meet those needs, the needs that they do have with cleaner and more cost-effective alternatives. We found there was a huge amount of untapped energy savings potential, that their claims about needing gas when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you've probably heard that before, were actually unfounded. And then there was a number of other technological fixes that would be more cost effective and could help with that reliability. And then, as everyone has talked about, we can't meet Minnesota's greenhouse gas reduction goals. We can't address the climate crisis if we're building new fossil fuel plants. So we, in addition to fighting it at the Public Utilities Commission and on the legal and technical sense, we also worked with a number of organizations to fight the plant by demonstrating a lot of public opposition. So this is a press conference, as Bridget said, it's a bad deal poster. That's what you're holding, that sign. And we were with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and consumer, oh shoot, now I'm forgetting what Buddy's group was named, and Citizens Utility Board, who I know Annie's on this call, talking about how this was not only a bad deal for our climate, but it was also a bad deal for customers. So it's going to cost $700 million, and we don't need it at all. I don't know why I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. All right, you can move to the next slide. Minnesota Citizens Federation, thank you, Annie, Northeast. In addition, Honor the Earth, and so Paul was the person who was going to speak today. They were also engaged in this issue at the Public Utilities Commission process, and actually brought to the forefront that the PUC process didn't include any environmental review. So in Minnesota, we have a law called the Minnesota Environmental Protection Act that requires that any major project has an environmental review so that we can see the impact that a project is going to have on our environment. And because the plant's in Superior, there was no environmental process in Minnesota. The assumption was it's going to happen in Wisconsin, and Honor of the Earth made the argument, you know, it's pretty close to Minnesota, right? It's going to have huge impacts. It's going to have climate impacts. It's going to have water impacts. It's going to have air impacts. We need to be looking at the environmental impacts in Minnesota as well. So in addition to requesting environmental review in the docket, they organized a citizens petition. So getting a ton of petitions signed to the Environmental Equality Board to call for environmental review. And that was submitted to the Public Utilities Commission. Go to the next slide. This process was actually run by an administrative law judge, and then the judge was supposed to make a recommendation to the PUC, and they did. They recommended the PUC deny this proposal. They agreed with our analysis that the plant was not needed. But unfortunately, as you'll see in the next slide, the Public Utilities Commission still approved the plant. Despite the fact that it was clear that Minnesota Power had not made a compelling case that the plant was needed, there was still a clear sense that Minnesota Power was going to need some gas on their system in order to move away from coal. And 3 of the commissioners voted to approve the plant, as you can see, and 2 of them voted to oppose it. Of the 3 that voted to support it, 2 are no longer on the commission. Everyone has a 6-year term on the commission, so they have termed out, and now there's 2 new commissioners replacing Nancy Lang and Dan Lipschultz. And one of the members who opposed the plant the first time around, Katie Sieben, is now the chair of the PUC. But the Public Utilities Commission did approve the plant. Next slide. But we're not done yet. We didn't agree with that decision. We didn't think that they made a good decision, so we appealed it. Sierra Club, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Honor the Earth appealed the decision. And so we won that decision. So we appealed it on a couple of different grounds. One, we made the case that the PUC that Minnesota Power did not adequately look at alternatives as is required by law, and that they did not do environmental review as required by law. And we won the case on the fact that they did not do environmental review. The Minnesota Appeals Court agreed that Minnesota law is very clear that a project that will have environmental impacts in Minnesota will needs to have environmental review. And so we were able to win that appeals case. Unfortunately, Minnesota Power then appealed that appeal. So we're still stuck in court, and you can go to the next slide. And it's actually in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court right now. So earlier this fall, there were oral arguments where you can see this little Zoom box. This is Evan Mulholland, who is the lawyer for Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, MCA, spoke on our behalf. And I believe Paul with Honor the Earth spoke as well to do our oral arguments. To argue again that we need environmental review on this project. I think the challenge for this project is that because it's in Wisconsin, this is why the Supreme Court took it up. It's like an interesting legal case, right? It's like, does that, because it is in Wisconsin and there is a process in Wisconsin that Greg's going to talk about, does that adequately count the environmental review that this project is going to have? We say no, and we are still fighting that battle. So right now it's at the Supreme Court. They will probably decide early in 2021 what to do. If they vote, or if they go in our favor, that means it will likely go back to the Public Utilities Commission. They'll be required to do an environmental review of the project and have a new decision, which we will, of course, say circumstances have changed in the last 3 years, and it's not looking any better for gas. In fact, we've seen recent studies in the last couple years showing that 90% of proposed new gas plants across the country can't compete with clean energy alternatives. We've done the same analysis for this plant, and NTEC cannot compete with clean energy alternatives. So if we are able to go back to the Public Utilities Commission when the Supreme Court rules, we will make that argument. If they argue, if Minnesota Power wins at the court, we're still not done. We will still make the argument in Minnesota Power's integrated resource plan, which is coming up this year. So it's a 15-year plan looking out to see how much electricity Minnesota Power needs to generate and how they're going to do it. And so that plan is due to the Public Utilities Commission on February 1st, and we will be very engaged in that process. They're assuming that NTEC will be built, and we will not be assuming that going into that conversation. So I'm going to end there. Thank you all for my impromptu sharing of NTEC, and I look forward to hearing from Greg about what's going on in Wisconsin.
Thank you, Jessica. And before I pass it over to Greg, just want to say thank you so much for that overview and bringing us all up to speed on the legal status of NTEC and all of the ways that we've been involved and the ways that we will continue to fight this plant in Minnesota. Noting some questions in the chat, thank you so much. Continue to place your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to address those in our Q&A section. And we'll pass it over to Greg Wanier, who is our staff attorney at the Sierra Club, who works really close with the Beyond Coal campaign and directly involved with the NTEC fight on the Wisconsin side. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. Hi there. Again, my name is Greg Wanier, he, him. I am based out of Berkeley, California, actually, which is where the Sierra Club headquarters are, and also the former land of the Ohlone tribe. I am going to talk to you about Wisconsin litigation. Is there a way to, I'm sorry to be technologically incompetent, but is there a way to get to my first slide? Okay, I guess that's the way to do it. That was obviously, Jessica gave a great overview of the plant and some of the litigation work that we've been doing on the Minnesota side. The proposed plant would be located in Wisconsin. And so we've been going through a slightly different process here in Wisconsin. The first slide is going to talk about the litigation that we concluded at the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. This was, so just to back up as a reminder, right, the NTEC plant has been jointly proposed by two different utilities. And on the Wisconsin side, that utility is Dairyland, which is actually a co-op. So it's jointly owned by a number of smaller municipal utilities in Northwest Wisconsin. And what that means in terms of what the Wisconsin case looked like is they had to file, they did need to get approval from the Wisconsin Public Service Commission to build the plant. You'll see here I have this section called issues. Essentially, what I'll call the live issues, the ones that we were able to contest here, were there's a requirement under Wisconsin law that thinking about the overall environmental impact of the plant, it is in the public interest to build. Among the issues that we talked about a lot in the PSC proceeding were groundwater supply. The cooling system as proposed was going to use a massive amount of the local groundwater, and there were concerns about whether that could deplete the aquifer. The proposed plant would be built at a wetland site near Superior or in Superior, and so there were numerous concerns about the wetlands impact. There were two different proposed sites. They were both located in wetland areas, so that was a issue at both. And the preferred site, which is the one that was ultimately approved at the PSC, although we're appealing that, I'll get to that, was also located at the top of relatively high embankment overlooking overlooking Lake Superior, and so there are concerns about erosion that were raised in the context of this discussion. There were other local impacts that we raised concerns about, including the impacts to the local community just from the construction activities. You know, when you're building a giant piece of infrastructure, that will have a huge impact on local air quality, et cetera. And then separately from this sort of public interest determination, is this plant in the public interest? We also raised concerns about the adequacy of their environmental risk assessment, I guess is the best way to put it. Wisconsin has a similar law to Minnesota where whenever a state agency approves any sort of action, they have to think about we have to think about the full scope of environmental impacts, and we don't think that they did that. Also, I'm going to move a little more quickly because we're a little behind schedule. But the important point here is there were no economic arguments available. Based on the way Wisconsin law works, we're not able to make any argument that the plant is, you know, a poor economic choice, that there are better options that would have been cheaper. So the outcome, of course, the commission did unfortunately vote to grant this certificate that the plant needed to move forward. That was in January of this year. It was a 2-to-1 vote. So the commissioner, Becky Volk, dissented, and she dissented in large part based out of concerns with the groundwater supply and some of the local wetland impacts and local impacts. And that says maybe, it's not maybe, she mentioned it in her dissent. That's my mistake. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about what we've done about that. So we appealed the PSC approval to Dane County Superior Court. We, you know, appealed basically on all the issues I just discussed. But one point that is worth mentioning is since we filed the appeal, I think in part in response to the very serious concerns that both the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and Commissioner Volk raised, and Sierra Club, of course, raised about the groundwater supply and whether there's enough groundwater in the aquifer to support the plant. They have actually proposed a redesign of the plant to switch to air cooling. And so that's, from an environmental perspective, that's fantastic news. It eliminates, you know, if this plant is built, which I hope it isn't, it will eliminate one of the worst impacts. It does change, obviously, the legal case that we have. So the remaining issues I've put here, there are still the wetlands impacts, still the other local impacts. There's still this question of whether they adequately considered all of the environmental results of building this. There, of course, there's no longer relevant argument about groundwater supply because they redesigned their cooling system. And there is a new issue, which is that former Commissioner Mike Hipsch, who stepped down in February, applied to become the CEO of Dairyland 2 months later. He did not ultimately get the job, but we believe that, just as a reminder, Dairyland is the entity that was applying for this. So we believe there are very serious potential conflicts of interest that result from the fact that Commissioner Hipsch stepped down early, we believe for the purpose of applying for the Dairyland job, and announced his decision to step down, again, we believe for the purpose of applying to the Dairyland job, 1 week before he filed a critical vote that granted Dairyland approval to build this plant. There have been a couple articles about this in Wisconsin. It's gotten a little bit of attention. I don't think I need to belabor this point to anyone, but there are major sort of due process concerns that were raised by this. And so as a result, we learned about this over the summer of 2020. And so we have been working in the last few months to add that issue and to get more discovery, to find out more about you know, what was going on with Commissioner Hipsch and what was going through his mind at the time, that he provided one of the deciding vote to approve this project. So I've given this sort of quick timeline here. I think it speaks for itself. We're still sort of going through trying to figure out how to add that issue to our complaint, but our appeal is still pending. We don't have any resolution there. And I think with that, I'm happy to answer questions, but I will turn it back for the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was great. I'm glad that you included the bit about hoops. And next, want to introduce our next speaker, and then we'll close out with some Q&A. So please keep putting your questions in the chat. Johnson Bridgewater is with us today. He's the director of Sierra Club's Oklahoma chapter, where he works on lots of different environmental issues. But today he's here to talk about fracking fossil gas. And Johnson is also from Apple Valley, Minnesota. So wanted to make sure that that was in there. Welcome, Johnson. Thank you for being here.
Hi there. Is my sound coming through okay?
Yes.
All right. Hey, thank you all so much for giving me a few minutes to talk sort of the actuality of what a natural gas plant represents. So full chain of custody from the point that gas is produced all the way to the point that it's burning in somebody's backyard. Sadly, it's a topic I could speak to for hours, but I'm going to just give a brief overview. To me, the most salient things for you all to think about relate to justice matters. And right before I do that, though, I would like to say, coming to you from Oklahoma, I think Oklahoma is one of the most misunderstood states in the United States. And so I wanted to share a little bit of what I consider wisdom about what Oklahoma actually is briefly. We actually have the second highest number of enrolled Native Americans in the United States, just behind California. So the state of Oklahoma is just behind California in number of enrolled, tribally enrolled Native Americans. The sad part of that reality, however, though, is Oklahoma has 39 federally recognized tribes, some others that are here that haven't gone down that path. Only 5 of them are in any way tied to Oklahoma. 34 of those 39 tribes were force marched to the state of Oklahoma away from their native lands, which amazingly, California, Montana, Minnesota, Nebraska, Georgia. So apologize for taking time away from the subject today, but I think it's important because this issue, as a couple of people have already commented on, this is about the creation in all of the lands up there, especially in the Great Lakes, such a deep tribal history. So anything that we're doing to air, land, and water up there, to me, is it's a bigger violation than just the physical material reality. Could you pull up? I think I have a couple slides. Maybe. All right. So I don't want to belabor this. I have this slide, and then I have one more that's just kind of a graphic. But the list of issues, what I would like you all to think about as you're fighting this plant. Natural gas is produced by fracking in the United States. That process jumped us to being one of the biggest producers of energy in the world. So just think about that. And at its inception, the concept of fracking was taken up by the EPA. Everything the EPA has authorized on fracking, so all of the legal framework at the federal level, it was written from an assumption that there will never be any leaks, that there will never be any spills, that the technology will never fail. So all the regulation on fracking at the federal level assumes a perfect, flawless system. Okay, so that's the problem here is we don't have a perfect flawless system. We have several issues that the laws to this day still aren't addressing. And I'm gonna give a brief overview. So on the production side, fracking happens from taking anywhere from 200 to 500 chemicals, mixing that with fresh water. Keep that in mind. It has to be good, clean water for the science to work. About 4 to 6 million gallons a hole per well. They inject that down. That is pumped down into the earth. Most of that stays down there. What comes back up is called fracking waste. And then that process, so they've fracked the well, they've injected the chemicals, they've mixed it with water. They get about 10% of that comes back out of the hole. Then the well goes into production. And at that point, what a lot of people don't realize is that fracking, the production of fracking energy, natural gas, it has a byproduct, which is called production water. And this is ancient water that nobody has yet to figure out a way to make usable, because again, it is mixed with about 10% of the fracking fluid. And this is coming out in trillions of gallons per year in a place like the state of Oklahoma. All of that water is then injected into the ground. It's waste, quote unquote, wastewater. So you have to imagine at the production end in those states, and Oklahoma was an epicenter, had trillions of gallons of waste product that were pumped under the ground. They are already finding farms where that waste is coming up through their farmlands. So we have entire farms in Kingfisher, Oklahoma that are, the estimate is they'll be useless for at least 40 years. That pressure that they're creating from the fracking process itself and the taking of trillions of gallons and shoving it under the earth created a tremendous amount of earthquakes. And people think I'm making this up. We had 22,000 earthquakes during the initial startup phase of fracking in the state of Oklahoma. Several buildings ruined. We had senior homes evacuated from damage. It was a real concern. Then, so you have water use, talking about using fresh water for all these fracking operations. You have the quality of that water after it's been used. You have earthquakes created from the use of that water. And then you get to the production, the midstream, and onto the power plant. And basically, I'm just going to summarize because I want to stay on time. There are kind of three major problems from the natural gas. There is methane leakage throughout the process, and I think there's a slide that has that on there. We have an unknown number of chemicals due to a law called the Cheney or Halliburton loophole, which means the chemicals used in the fracking process, they are allowed to exempt certain chemicals from registration and acknowledgement as they call it a trade secret. So we don't actually know what they're pumping down and getting into the system. And then they're producing the gas, all the while producing this toxic wastewater. They're producing the gas and shipping it in the midstream. Thousands of miles of people's property rights. That's something that I don't think people think a lot about. But eminent domain, natural gas pipelines riddle the United States. It's one of the most shocking maps you can imagine. Pull up a pipeline map. It's amazing. Then you get to where the plant is, and you're actually burning the product and you're shipping the product in. So you have all the issues there of local justice. But overall, the reason that I think this is such an important justice issue is you have a product that's being produced at the expense of state, local, city governments, being pumped at the expense of private property, and being shipped to places where it is almost always the toxic byproducts are dumped in, and the power plants are almost always placed in poor or even poor and rural areas. And it's fairly consistent. They don't have the political or the legal power to push back against these systems. What I'll close on is, apart from traditional environmental concerns, air, land, water impacts, we could just get down to brass tacks, which has already been discussed in the legal case. The economics of these plants, all these are an attempt by corporations to cash in on their guaranteed rights as investor-owned utilities. Produce this facility that, based on all the economics right now and the way all of the major investment firms are going, these plants will be obsolete shortly after they're built. However, those costs are going to carry on for a long time to the ratepayers and the consumers of the product. And then lastly, so the economics just aren't valid anymore, but in closing, back to justice, these power plants, somebody mentioned this earlier, if you live in Superior, Wisconsin, the plant is there. That doesn't mean you'll ever see a single drop of that energy. So these are all part of systems that ship the energy all over. So it's a distributed cost of basically who's being impacted by the overall cycle. But there is usually a huge disconnect between where the power is being produced and where the people receiving that power. And so that's the tricky part, is bringing everybody together to understand that even if they don't live next to that plant, if they're making use of that energy, they're part of this system as well. Thanks so much. Hope I didn't ramble too much. This is a big topic for me.
Thank you, Johnson. Oh yes, we could spend like spend days on every single environmental and climate justice impact that fossil gas and fracking have on our communities. I'm going to ask QME to scoot us on to the next slide. There we go. Before we jump into a little bit of Q&A with our fabulous presenters, I would love to turn it over to all 50 of our participants and ask you, what can we do as activists and as a community, both in Minnesota and Wisconsin and together in the Twin Ports, what can we be doing to stop this gas plant? And I'll invite folks to just think and share their thoughts in the chat for a moment. And thank you so much to Bridget and Jessica and Greg and Johnson once again for sharing your experiences and your expertise with us about NTEC. And I think we can move it on to our Q&A section. I know that a couple of folks had put questions in the chat, so we'll get to those first. But feel free to come off of mute, and if that gets too hairy, then we'll throw questions in the chat and we'll do kind of a question lineup of folks. But seeing some really good answers here. Keep listening to our tribal communities. Continue to work on our story and on our narrative by writing letters to the editor, educating the public. That's great. Talking to local decision makers about all of this. These are wonderful ideas and opportunities for us to engage as activists. So I want to answer Lily's or get a response for Lily's question, which was, can we call the Public Utilities Commission? What is the opportunity there? And maybe that's a question that that Jessica or Greg can answer. How can we let the public utilities know right now that this is a bad deal?
Well, in Minnesota, because it's stuck at the Supreme Court, we can't really tell the Supreme Court anything. We can talk to the Public Utilities Commission in particular as part of the Integrated Resource Plan process. So once the plan is filed in February, there'll be open public comment period and a few months to weigh in and we'll be calling on them to both to retire the coal plant that they're running and to stop and not build the NTEC plant. So there's opportunities there. And actually, Jenna can probably share in the chat, we've got a petition for folks to sign that we'll be delivering to Minnesota Power, and we'll likely share with the PUC when the docket is open as well. And then Greg can answer for Wisconsin.
Yep. I was just going to say, at this point, just because we are in litigation at the Wisconsin State Court, there isn't a decision pending at the PSC. But our ultimate goal with that litigation is to get back to the commission, get them to reconsider, and at that point, that would be a, I'd say, prime moment for the public to weigh in and let the commission know how they feel.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Jessica. We're going to throw some petitions in the chat for folks to copy and go to, and I'm just kind of sifting through the chat here because I know a few folks had some good questions. I think Jenny, you had a question. Just looking that you've maybe you want to ask your question and come off mute. Thanks.
Hi, this is Jenny. I'm not sure which question. Is it the statement about Gretchen Whitmer or is it the one to Johnson?
Yep, that question.
Okay, so Johnson, my question is that I've read many books and other articles that say fracking is actually okay for the environment if it's done within all regulations and I have to go back to my question. But anyways, if it's done within all regulations and they follow all the environmental protections, that actually fracking is a good way to get natural gas out of the land. And I realize that companies always cut corners and they rarely follow environmental standards, even though they say they will. And I'm playing devil's advocate. So I'm wondering your thoughts on if fracking can ever be a viable, clean way of producing energy.
Sure. So we'll start with the answer that having spent the past 5 years at the state capitol, I'll share the answer that counters that. So I'll give you the false logic first. The economics no longer work. So even if this process was perfect, as the EPA assumed it would be when it recognized it and administered it, the economics just don't work any longer. So I would say no, this wouldn't be a viable system on that alone. 5 years from now, certainly 10 years from now, these plants will be collateral damage, uneconomic remnants. In terms of the actual process itself, I guess I would say, and this isn't directed at you because I know you're doing this for the sake of trying to help people understand how to argue it. Yes, ferries, I love ferries, they're awesome. I wish they existed, but they don't. And what I mean by that is, I'm in Oklahoma in the heart of this process. We literally have people die. And I don't think Americans realize this. Every year in Oklahoma, we have about a dozen people die from natural gas related accidents, either in production or just through the pumping of the pipelines. So my short answer is no. I don't believe that you could ever make this economically, naturally appealing, no matter what precautions are put in place.
Thanks. That helps.
And I'm sorry, one last addendum as far as facts to talk to people about. The state of Oklahoma is producing trillions of gallons of waste product that nobody knows how to treat. So that would be where I would spend some time. Make these people understand, and if they're for it, make them explain to you they're getting a free pass. They're dumping all this stuff under the states. Nobody's getting any reimbursement for when this starts flowing back, which it already is. Thanks. Sorry for taking so.
Thanks, Johnson. There's a question about who is going to be paying for this gas plant if it ends up as a stranded asset. I think that's a great question to end on. And maybe I'll pass it over to Jessica or Greg to answer that, and then we'll wrap up for today.
I'd say we,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
oh, go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I was going to say, ultimately, the people who end up paying are the ratepayers. That's always the case, and that's sort of for me, the biggest frustration with a lot of these plants that have been built is, on the Minnesota side, it's a simpler story. You have a fully regulated utility that can go to the commission and get recovery for basically all of the costs that the commission deems to be prudent. And so if the commission approves it and says this is a reasonable thing to build, then ratepayers have to foot the bill. So that's why we do the work that we do, is to prevent these sort of giant money pits from being pushed onto the consumers. On the Wisconsin side, it's a slightly different story with the same ultimate result. Because it's a co-op, Dairyland, as I mentioned before, doesn't need to actually get direct approval from the commission to build this. They just need sort of the permitting. But Dairyland is, as I said before, jointly owned by a series of local municipal electricity supply organizations. And so that they're a collective, right? And that means that they collectively pay for all of the expenses within Dairyland service territory. So that means that those smaller electricity supply organizations, which really means the people living in those towns, are and will continue to be responsible for the cost of that plant.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you all again so much for joining. We'll end with sharing our next steps. There were so many great ideas, and we encourage you to get after those, write letters to the editor, make comments known to the Public Utilities Commission in both states. You can tweet at the utilities CEOs, and one last time we'll share in the chat both petitions to Minnesota Power and petitions to Dairyland that let them know that we, the people who they are supposed to serve, need to be committing to a transition to clean, affordable, and equitable energy. We will be following up via email, of course, with all sorts of next steps and ways to get involved, and are just so grateful for everyone's time and energy and care. It really is taking all of us together to fight this and build a better world together. So if everyone wants to come off mute, you can, and say goodbye, and we'll let you go have a weekend. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jadine. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks,
Take
Jenna.
care. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks, Bridget. And
Bye,
Buddy.
everybody. Thank you for
Absolutely
coming.
no fossil fuel infrastructure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ellen.